The title of this video is a bit misleading because knowledge of and access to the wheel or wheeled transport was readily available in West Africa during the era of kingdoms and empires. However, popular narratives often suggest that Africans never made use of the wheel or invented the wheel. So today, I wanted to speak on this history and allow for a new perspective to take form in the general consciousness. What up, African world? It's Home Team here, and welcome back to another video of African history, culture, and worldview. By supporting this channel on Patreon, you're helping in the creation of these videos and contributing to this content. On Patreon, you can find more in-depth courses on African history. This video is a part of a larger collaborative effort known as South of the Sahara, spearheaded by the YouTube channel From Nothing. There are many brilliant creators included in this project, and their videos will be included in a linked playlist by the end of the video, so please feel free to check them out. The purpose of this video has a dual aspect to it. The principal effort is to provide more insight as to why the wheel was so seldom put to use in West Africa, which in part addresses the question of invention. The secondary effort is intended to reduce the effectiveness of more tawdry attempts at discrediting African civilization based on Eurasian value systems, if you will. This video will be focusing on wheeled transport specifically, so please keep that in mind. One is astonished at the rather convenient monomania surrounding the wheel question as it concerns the African continent, a question usually advanced with negative undercurrents. The dark continent trope seems to demand persistent axiomatic conclusions in order to stay afloat in the 21st century. Despite this baggage, the wheel question about the African continent is a fair one when done with genuine curiosity. Despite its fame as a trump card in popular discourse and attempts at discrediting African civilization, in the scholarly world, ironically, it's been little discussed. The non-adoption of the wheel in pre-colonial Africa, despite its obviously central importance for an understanding of the character of African societies, has attracted surprisingly little attention from historians of the continent. Many general histories of Africa, indeed, fail altogether to mention the absence of the wheel, far less to offer any explanation of it. It's certainly true that Africans seem to have made less use of wheeled transport. They seem to have relied more on pack animals and human porterage. It's important to make the distinction between the scarcity of wheeled transport and its non-existence altogether. West Africa in particular had a scarcity of wheeled transport, not a non-existence. One of the principal arguments, however, is not necessarily the existence of wheeled transport, but the invention of it altogether, and perhaps the historical context of environment, statewide decision-making, and profitability may satisfactorily answer the question. In short, the scarcity of use of wheeled transport upon introduction, especially in West Africa, may have some connection as to why it was not deemed important enough to invent in the first place. Ancient Egypt seems to exemplify this historical perspective. The wheel is known in ancient Egypt from the Old Kingdom at the latest. However, except for chariots, there is only rare evidence for the use of wheeled carts and wagons as means of transport, probably because of the climatic and geomorphological conditions in Egypt. The annual inundation also prevented the building of a large-scale road network, which would have been necessary for an increased use of wheeled vehicles. This quote serves as a good model for why wheeled transport was so rare in Africa. In fact, the only reason the Egyptians used wheeled chariots is because they saw how the Hyksos used it against them militarily. Other than that, wheeled transport was rarely in use according to documented history. There are multiple theories advanced by scholars attempting to explain the reason. The most salient among them seems to come from A.G. Hopkins. Hopkins argues that even in those areas of West Africa where potential draft animals were available, wheeled transport was uneconomic because its greater cost was not justified by proportionately greater returns, and more particularly because the poor quality of the roads would have greatly reduced the efficiency of wheeled vehicles, and the cost of improving the road system would have been prohibitive. The reason for the lack of wheeled transport in West Africa seems to actually rest on circular reasoning. Hopefully, you'll understand what I mean later. When Europeans began to trade with the West African coast, they brought with them wheeled transport. They even gifted various African kings with certain luxurious carriages. Interestingly enough, the introduction of wheeled transportation into West Africa immediately created logistical problems that even some Europeans didn't want to deal with. In the 1860s, the Basel Mission at Christiansburg established workshops to build wheeled carts, imported oxen to draw them, and embarked upon the construction of roads for the carts to use. But this project had little commercial impact, and the road building effort was soon abandoned. In the 1880s, a mining company operating in the Tarkwa district introduced two-wheeled trucks in order to convey heavy machinery into the interior. At the first attempt, it took 57 men a fortnight to transport 1.5 tons of machinery a distance of 70 miles, provoking the comment that at this rate, of course, it would never pay to use trucks. One European Gold Coast trader was urged by the British governor to adopt wheeled transport. He replied, "It would take 8 men to a cart, allowing for the carts going into ditches, or in wet weather sticking in ruts. Therefore," he said, "he certainly should not use carts." So some of the primary reasons for the discouraged use of wheeled transport in West Africa was the lack of draft animals, the cost of humans to transport the wheeled vehicles due to the lack of draft animals, and finally, the cost of creating appropriate roads. And it wasn't as though Africans were incapable of creating roads. In fact, one of the most incredible roads in West Africa was in Dahomey. This remarkable road was a route that took people from Dahomey's Atlantic port to the royal capital. Other roads were commissioned in Ghana in the Ashanti Kingdom. Now, of course, this is just to show the capability, but the widespread construction of wider roads or more paved roads in West Africa would require enormous cost, one that would likely outweigh any benefit from acquiring suitable terrain for wheeled transport. And so, as mentioned previously, the issue became rather circular. I think Robin Law puts it best. The conventional notion that Africans failed to employ the wheel because of lack of initiative or intelligence is intellectually unsatisfactory, not so much because it is racialist as because it is circular. Africans are supposed to have ignored the wheel because they were unenterprising, and the evidence that they were unenterprising is that they failed to adopt the wheel. In other contexts, notably in their widespread adoption of the use of imported European firearms, Africans proved eagerly receptive to innovation, and it cannot therefore be argued that they were in general conservative in their responses to new technology. There must, logically, be some special explanation for their lack of interest in the practical application of the technology of wheeled transport. In other words, we can't holistically apply Eurasian value standards to the African continent, and vice versa. Another example would be the history of early firearms in Africa. One would immediately assume the superiority of firearms as it was effective in other parts of the world, but in Africa, earlier firearms were brought into question. Richard Gray, for example, argued that firearms had little effect in the attempted Portuguese conquest in Mozambique at just about the same time as the wars in Angola began. If the Portuguese who fought in Congo in 1491 carried firearms, they must have been unimpressed themselves with their performance, for the equipment of the 1509 force sent to Congo included only pikes and crossbows. The inaccuracy of early firearms, coupled with African warfare tactics and terrain, rendered European military value systems less effective on the African continent during the 16th and 17th centuries. It wasn't until the invention of the Maxim gun in the 19th century that European military superiority became abundantly clear. And so, this serves as a minor parallel with wheeled transport in West Africa. Some Eurasian value systems, such as wheeled transport, weren't such the utility in the case of the African continent as some may promote in popular discourse. The subjective issue of wheeled transport in West Africa was only resolved when the economic or environmental factors were tamed. Well, I'm all out, guys. Be sure to check out the other creators included in this project in the linked playlist. And if you like these videos, you can support the home team on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. Know thyself. Remember your ancestors. Peace.